I completely understand that makeup should not be about what other people say, and I know that makeup is not supposed to be about looking pretty, right? Because when I'm not wearing makeup, I stand a higher chance of being called a man. People like me kill themselves on a daily basis. Namaste. Hi. Sup. Okay. Okay, let's just get to it.
So 23-year-old Trinetra Haldar Gummaraju has really lived life on her own terms, encouraging all of us to re-examine preconceived notions about gender and identity. Trinetra, I've read several of your interviews, followed your work closely, and you've spoken very movingly about how difficult it was for you to get to this point. It wasn't always easy, like so many people who go through this journey. There was not just denial, but there was also cruelty from other people. There was also sexual abuse. Can you tell us a little bit about those growing up years, what your struggles were, and how you grappled with them?
Sure. So, Barkha, growing up when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I would say that that's the first time I figured out that I was different. I'm often asked, when did you know you were different? So, I just like to say that I was made to feel different. There were neighbors, there were relatives, there were friends, and it became very apparent to me around age 3 or 4 that what I expected of myself was very different from what society expected of me. And that sort of mismatch in expectations, I mean, that's when I knew that something was off. And as the years passed, I was called a plethora of names, and I started to realize that what I am is something that's just not acceptable at all. And you start to understand words like homosexual and transgender as you sort of move into your teenage years and discover the internet. But there is just so much conditioning built into you by that point that there is just an immense amount of shame associated with being transgender, being any identity within the LGBTQ plus umbrella. And a child, when subjected to that kind of hatred from every direction, be it family, be it friends, be it teachers, a child has nowhere to put that hatred and sort of disgust apart from themselves. You direct it within, right? And by the time I was 15, 16 years old, I was just in complete denial about who I was. And, it took many, many years of unlearning and sort of undoing all of that conditioning. And here we are today.
I read that you were molested. You had to face abuse as a younger person, and I'm sorry
Yes.
to ask you to relive that moment. But I always say that it's important for us to be able to talk about these things openly, so we can encourage
Yes.
others to do the same. So, were you targeted for being different, or were you targeted because people, there was some power sort of assertion by the men who did this to you? If you can, will you share that with us?
Sure. So it's not just one instance or two instances. This is something that, someone that's different in the way that I was is subjected to time and time again. And it started when I was in school, when I was in the eighth, ninth standards, because that was when, and I've always been this person that's very outspoken, vocal about what I believe in, and in the eighth and ninth grades, when I sort of discovered that I'm queer, which at that time meant that I was attracted to men, as someone that was assigned male at birth. The perception around me was that I was a gay man, right? But I was, of course, always extremely effeminate. I never shied away from expressing myself flamboyantly. And just, I was always true to myself. I never sort of was scared of what people might say. But that was obviously a very easy target. There were students, there were even teachers who would call me names, that would call me slurs, and very often there would be bigger guys, a lot stronger than me, bigger than me, who would come and touch me and molest me and saying things like, is this not what you want? Is this not what people like you are fond of? And I had no one to go to because I couldn't go to my teachers. I couldn't go to my parents because they were still sort of dealing with it. I came out to them 10 years ago. It's been a long time. So back then, their level of awareness was not what it is today. And there was an instance in Delhi where it was a German language camp, and we would have a bit of a dance floor thing every night, a very fun kiddie thing. But there were a group of guys who were much bigger, much taller, stronger, and I had already come out to everybody as attracted to men, so to speak, and um, it was just a very, very easy target. I was out there in the public eye with my identity. And yes, I was molested there as well. And professors, teachers knew about it. They just chose to do nothing about it. They just swept it under the rug and pretended like it didn't happen. And only a few years ago in therapy did I bring it up and sort of process it and accept that, okay, what happened to me was in fact sexual violence and it was not okay.
One of the things that happens with those who have faced sexual abuse, especially as children, and I've had my own experience of that, is that it
So
actually.
sorry.
Thank you. And I mean, we're here to talk openly, so it's only fair that I speak openly as well. And one of the things that happens is that sometimes it can make you very terrified of sex, of sexuality. Did you go through that journey?
Absolutely. I think that for me, there were two things that sort of made me extremely uncomfortable with my body and my identity. One thing was, of course, the gender incongruence, the gender dysphoria. The fact that my identity did not match the one that I was assigned at birth. That was, of course, a huge factor, that caused me discomfort in my own skin. But whenever you go to therapy to discuss these things, because any transgender person, before we have surgery or any intervention, typically it is mandated that you undergo some kind of therapy and just make sure that everything is fine. And something that was brought up by my therapist was this source of discomfort, if there were other sources apart from the gender incongruence. And that's when these experiences came up, because I was terrified of intimacy of any kind, both emotional and physical. And that's when I, for the first time, dealt with the fact that I had faced these things, and it has created a significant impact on my mental health and the way that I associate with my body and with other people's bodies, and how I allow myself to feel vulnerable. And that's still a work in progress, and
Yeah.
still trying to deal with it and unlearn and move on, I guess.
And in your case, as so often actually happens even with those who aren't dealing with this gender incongruence, those you thought would protect you, teachers, professors, older people, were part of the problem. They were part of mocking you. They were part of making fun of you. Not all of them, maybe, but some of them.
Absolutely, especially teachers. I think that, I was always a straight A student. I tried my very best to at least gain that little bit of validation, because your grades are street cred in India. If you have that one thing going for you, you have a lot going for you. And I tried my very best. I really did. But, despite that, there were teachers that would call me names, who would have me stand up in class and, crack jokes at my expense and have the whole class bawling and literally bursting into laughter. It was a truly disheartening experience, because you expect that you put in the work and you expect that you be respected for it, but that's not how trans lives function in this country,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
So, Trinita, when your teachers and your professors were making fun of you, those who were, what were the sort of things that they would say to you? And this is despite your being an A-grader student.
So I would say that things were a little different in high school as compared to college. Back in high school, I didn't know how to stand up for myself at all. I didn't have the vocabulary, I didn't have the language, I didn't have the resources. I was absolutely and completely helpless and at their mercy. And teachers would always somehow pick on my voice. I take a lot of pride in my voice even today, with respect to the way I articulate, and even if it is deep sounding, I think it is resounding, and I take a lot of pride in that.
So is
But
mine.
and I think, and I absolutely adore that when we as women are able to make our voice heard, and it's something I take a lot of pride in. But in school, before I hit puberty number one, so to speak, teachers really like to pick on my voice. They would have me stand up in class and read out paragraphs and then imitate. in front of the entire class, and the whole class would burst out laughing because I sounded effeminate. And in college, it was a whole other sort of environment altogether, wherein for the first time I was exposed to the kind of transphobia and the hatred that the medical fraternity actively partakes in. It's quite disgusting, and it is the reason that trans people don't get the care that they deserve. I was thrown out of class for getting my nose pierced. I was asked uncomfortable questions in my Viva sessions. I still remember in my forensic medicine Viva, the questions almost exclusively sort of revolved around bestiality and sexual perversions and all of the other things that homosexuality and transgender identity are just included with, in an almost Freudian manner.
Who was asking these questions? The teachers?
Sometimes they were externals, sometimes there were professors from my college. Yes.
Can you give an example?
So in my first year, this is anatomy. Anatomy is a first year subject, right? So this was a time that I was just starting to understand my gender identity. Because, if you look at the mainstream, gender identity is not talked about much. You will see portrayals of homosexuality perhaps, but transgender people will always be the butt of the really crass joke. They will never sort of be talked about with nuance. So I didn't have access to that. So I discovered that much later. When I was speaking to a therapist, he said, try and explore what seems right to you, try and dress a different way, try and call yourself different pronouns, see how you feel about that. So something that I had always wanted to do was get my nose pierced, and I did. I got my nose pierced in the first year. And I, at that time, was still a very, very focused student. After transition, things became a lot more difficult. But back then, I was still studying very, very hard and, just absolutely focused. And I topped my anatomy table test, my, class test. And the very next day, I was called to said professor's office, and she said, "Get up, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm not quite violating any rules because, no rule book says that a male person, so to speak, or someone assigned male at birth can't do this. And I'm just trying to understand myself here." And she was just not having it. She decided to tell the entire department and all of the professors to not let me into a single class, be it afternoon classes, morning classes, whatever. And I had to go and get it pulled out of my nose about a week, about like a couple of days later. And only then was I allowed to enter once again. And this is despite doctors knowing full well the kinds of complications associated with a piercing being taken out early, and doctors having to know things about gender and sexuality. Despite all of that, you see that doctors are really not all that aware of what people can be and the diversity in human beings. And it was just the most disheartening thing, because I realized that the profession I chose just doesn't want me. So that's one of my biggest dilemmas even today. Will I have a successful future as a doctor? I don't know. So yeah, that remains to be seen, I suppose.
I mean, I think what really strikes me is the levels of cruelty that people are capable of over like nothing at all, just not being able to confirm bias, basically, right? But
Yes.
talk a little bit about what you just said, that you're still in doubt about whether you'll be a happy doctor, a doctor who's accepted among her people, among her fraternity. Why do you feel that? And what first drew you to medicine?
So what first drew me to medicine? Now, when I was in, the 11th and 12th grades, my grandfather was very, very sick. He was in a lot of pain. He had issues with his lungs, his heart, his prostate, and he was in a lot of pain. He was an extremely integral sort of part of my growing up years. He was a kind of parent that neither of my parents was, and he was someone that was so active his entire life, and he would go out of his way to make sure that my brother and I got what we needed financially and otherwise. And when he fell sick, I saw him sort of wither away every day and become this person that he did not recognize. he inhabited a body he did not want to, and I just saw him be miserable for those 2 years. And every day he would tell me, "Become a doctor, so you can do better by people like me." So that was one of the biggest reasons behind me sort of getting interested in medicine. Apart from the fact that I've always illustrated, I've always drawn and created art, and I always felt like the operating room is a place that I can use that skill in a noble sort of way. And those, I think, were the two major reasons. Now, of course, after getting into medical school and coming out and seeing how bad the situation is for trans people and the kind of access that we have, the third and possibly the biggest reason today would be to create the kind of care that we deserve but do not get.
Well, I hope things change. People like you are at the front line of trying to change those attitudes. We're here. This series is called The Female Voice, and
Yes.
it's a complicated thing because there's a part of me that doesn't believe in the sort of essentialism of gender. The whole concept of gender is
Yes.
that there's a versus nature debate. And yet, as I
Yes.
grow older, I realize that there are certain things that are gendered. There is a gendered experience. There is something that we experience when we identify as female that alters our experience of the universe when we identify as male.
Absolutely.
Can you speak to that? That once your journey was complete, you had moved from having born a boy, but then you are a trans woman today. That female experience, online, offline, how would you
Yeah.
characterize it?
Right. So, firstly, I just like to say that there's a lot of trans exclusionists, a lot of TERFs who are constantly sort of berating us and saying that you experienced male privilege for a long time. Well, I just like to say that even if there were scraps of male privilege, the kind of experience that I had growing up was not remotely comparable to cisgender heterosexual men, because simply that I identified as a woman, and not just the discomfort that I had with my own identity and body, but there was so much violence directed at me throughout my life. So it's not as if that I've only started experiencing the oppression of a woman after I transitioned. That's absolutely not true. And particularly as a trans woman, there is the additional layer of oppression as a trans person. I'm not saying that I experience every kind of oppression. I do not. I can't deny my caste privilege, my class privilege, my education, my religion, all of that. But every trans person experiences a kind of oppression that is very distinct. And over the years, that's become more and more and more evident to me. And just recently we heard about, just yesterday, in fact, Sangeeta. She was a trans woman in Coimbatore, right? She was running a trans kitchen, something called the Kovai Trans Kitchen, and she was brutally murdered. Brutally murdered. And it's very disheartening because, like I said, as the years go by and I become more and more of a public persona, so to speak, as I become closer and closer to the mainstream, it just becomes very obvious that society can't stand it. The closer a trans person gets to the mainstream, we're killed. We're discarded because we don't belong there. We're not seen like we're part of the mainstream. And so that is something that I experience both online and offline every day. The abuse is incessant, and I'm sure you know how it feels, Barkha, right? So it's
Oh yes, oh yes, I
yes.
do.
And
And here's the dilemma. I've
yeah,
always dealt, when I was younger, I used to deal with abuse by engaging with it and arguing with it, thinking that proved I was tough. When I'm older,
yeah,
I'm able to ignore it. But there is a question about why we should ignore it. We aren't living in boot camp.
absolutely. I think I used to be sort of very scared to say something. I was always taught to sort of keep my mouth shut, just as girls are in Indian society. Much as I was assigned male at birth, just talking about these things, talking about being LGBTQ plus or anything like that, it was just so stigmatized that silence was so ingrained and silence was so conditioned that I just didn't know how to stand up to people for the longest time. And over the years, yes, I have learned to disengage, but I've sort of learned also when to stand up for myself. that when something does go wrong, I have taught myself to use my voice, even if it means screaming in the most masculine voice possible, because that's the only kind of shouting that most people will understand. But yeah,
And how much the world does not like a woman who shouts or talks loudly.
absolutely, absolutely. And every day I learn to speak up for myself and also pick and choose my battles and know when not to sort of engage when it's just not worth it. But it does take a toll. I will definitely say that it does take a toll.
How did your parents adjust to your journey? Tell us a little bit about your family.
So I have a brother who's 4 years younger, and my parents. So growing up, it was the four of us and my grandfather that I called Dadu. So all of us, we lived in Hyderabad for the first several years of my life, and my father was a very typical man in a lot of ways. He tried very hard to masculinize me. He tried very hard to get me to do all the boy things and bought me cricket bats and all of these things that men will typically do. Not that women don't do those things growing up. It's just that I was not that kind of a person, right? And every effort failed. He tried to masculinize my voice, the way I spoke, the way I sang, the way I gestured, the way I moved my hands. So I just could not control those things about myself because it was just who I was. And my mother was, of course, a little bit more accepting. She would let me wear her saris and she would let me wear her jewelry once in a while. But once I became 7, 8 years old and it was clearly not a phase anymore, everybody was like, okay, you have to stop, Trinetra, this is not okay. And, they were trying to understand with whatever limited experience and knowledge that they had, how to be good to me. And at age 10, I was taken to a psychiatrist for the first time because clearly this was not a phase. And I was convinced something was wrong with me. They were convinced something was wrong with me. And the psychiatrist was untrained. I mean, she was one of the best in Hyderabad. I don't recall her name, but I very distinctly remember sitting in front of her and she said, you should spend more time with your father, or you probably lack a masculine influence in your life. And your mom should probably quit her job and sit at home so you experience more traditional gender roles. And I was just so confused because it was confirmed that I was abnormal. A doctor is saying it, and my parents didn't know what to make of that either, so they had very limited information at the time. But it became clear to me that I couldn't open up to them about these things because, of the way that they were reacting to my identity. And when I started being bullied, it just didn't strike me to have a conversation with them. Whenever I would try, they were dismissive about it. And when I finally came out at age 14, 13, 14, saying that, listen, why are you making fun of Karan Johar? Like it's just not okay. You can talk about his work, just don't talk about his sexuality that way. It's just not cool. And, they would just avoid the conversation altogether. Like Indian families like to do that. We like to keep things quiet. We don't discuss things that make us uncomfortable. And it took 2, 3, 4 years for them to Google things, understand things, talk to other therapists. So they did put in the effort there. I have to give them that. They tried hard to understand what was going on. And by the time I came out as trans several years later in college, they kind of saw it coming. It wasn't too much of a surprise to them. So we still have our issues. We still fight, of course. They're still learning how to parent a daughter because they didn't have the time to adjust to that. And suddenly they have a woman that's very bold about her body, about her opinions, and they just do not know how to deal with it. But they learn
But
it.
that's like all Indian parents and all daughters, right? So of course, with your added sort of complex,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you were born into a different gender. Now I have to ask you about J.K. Rowling. Um,
yes,
First, tell me, did you read her? Did you love her?
yes.
Yeah. So were you angry at her when she
I
sort of
did.
made?
I absolutely adore. I was furious because she destroyed the safe haven that she created for me and so many other. I have the books literally in my background right now. It was just very, very disheartening because I think growing up we had very few safe spaces. We really did, and books and films and theater and whatever else. These things were the tiny safe spaces that we had. And to the extent that when I was in college, in my first 2 years in college, I lived in boys' hostel because I had not figured it out. And later on, I was denied girls' hostel. I still don't have access to it. So, I created a short film called The Girl in the Boys' Hostel, and it had very strong J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter references. So it was close to my heart. And to see her over the years make statements that are not just sort of phobic, but very, very violent when she says things like, you should not have access to certain spaces, that, trans women and women are two separate categories, that they deserve different spaces and different rights. And for her to sort of use her own trauma to exclude trans women from this sort of narrative, it's very, very disheartening. So J.K. Rowling in her narrative said that trans women don't deserve women-only spaces such as washrooms and accommodation and so on. And that hit very, very hard because when I was still sort of figuring out who I am and I would go to the hospital and meet my therapist, I was escorted out of a ladies' restroom, right? And because I apparently didn't look woman enough. And my therapist's answer to that was just wear a sari the next time. I mean, do you know how difficult it is to go to the washroom in a sari? Are you kidding? But it's just dehumanizing. Why should I have to conform to a certain image of femininity to prove my gender identity to anybody? And Rowling's narrative really plays into that. We have to sort of display a certain level of pathos. We need to display a certain degree of anatomy, and only then will we be sort of treated the same way as other women, despite the fact that we experience a level of violence that is further than cis women. That trans women are possibly one of the most marginalized, communities in India, and we face sexual violence all the time when we don't have access to spaces that we deserve. So, Rowling sort of making her transphobia so evident, showing support so openly for transphobic people and so on and so forth. I'm done. I'm selling those books.
Oh, don't sell the books. Don't sell the books. I think we all outgrow, the politics of people that we've grown up reading. For me, I outgrew Germaine Greer. When I turned 18, I was gifted a book of her essays called The Mad Woman's Underclothes, and then I later saw the sort of positions she would take, and I was just like, oh my god! But that book at the age of 18 was still great. So, Trinetra, I have to ask you this in the end because this is where we actually started your story. And it was about looking at that video of you doing makeup on your YouTube channel and a very keen awareness of the male gaze, how it expects a woman to look like, the sort of whole beauty myth, the beauty burden. But at the same time, needing this makeup as almost an instrument of asserting female identity. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that in the end and how you grapple with that as a feminist, but also as a trans woman asserting your identity.
Right. So for me, I feel like asserting my identity is a very important part of being a doctor. Right. My first and foremost duty when I step into the hospital and talk to a patient is I need to make that patient feel comfortable. And if I appear a certain way that makes a patient uncomfortable, I'm not going to learn effectively. I'm not going to be able to prescribe or treat or just be the kind of doctor that I want to be. So I think every individual trans person has their own sort of idea of what they would like to look like so as to be able to survive. I think that there is a huge amount of pressure that feminists, especially trans exclusionists, put on trans women because you say on the one hand that if you don't look woman enough, you're not woman enough. And on the other hand, if you do put in the effort to look a certain way, you're playing into stereotypes. So where do you go? It's very, very unfortunate that the onus of disassembling patriarchy is placed solely on the heads of trans people, which is absurd to me. Because at the end of the day, we as trans people are only trying to survive an extraordinarily binary world. We're trying to navigate extremely binary spaces that don't want us there. So if I were to live in a world where I could walk into a hospital and a patient would not treat me with disdain, or navigate spaces in family, in institutions, and so on and so forth, and I would be treated with respect, perhaps I wouldn't feel the need to present myself a certain way. Perhaps I wouldn't feel a certain kind of discomfort. But every trans person is just trying to survive, the best way that they can, and every aesthetic, every way of presentation is equally valid.
I mean, the politics of beauty is something that I think all of us navigate every single day. It's such a complicated minefield.
Indeed.
I'm going to say thank
Yes.
you, more power to you. Keep being the
Thank you
inspiring
so much,
person
Barka.
you are. Keep shining the light of individualism and choice. I think these are such important values for all women to remember, and that is what the female voice is all about, and also to give voice to those who have been
Yeah.
silenced. That is what it's about.
Thank you so
Trinetra,
much. Thank you for having me.
thank you.